Hey everyone, today in this video we're going to talk about the fast response cardiac action potentials. So this is a continuation from the previous video. We talked about slow response cardiac action potentials, which were the pacemakers of the heart, such as the SA node, the AV node, bundle of His and Purkinje fibers. So the fast response cardiac action potentials represent the cardiac myocyte or the ventricular myocyte. As you probably remember from the first video, there's different phases of the membrane potential. When it comes to the fast response cardiac action potentials, there's actually 5 phases compared to only 3 in the slow response cardiac action potentials. So at around negative 85 to negative 90 millivolts, depending on the textbooks you read, there's phase 4, which is a flat line because it's a resting membrane potential. Phase 0 starts at the sudden increase in membrane potential, leading to a peak of about 50 or 40 millivolts, depending on the textbook you read again, followed by phase 1, which is partial depolarisation, as the membrane potential drops slightly, leading into phase 2, which is plateau, which again is a flat membrane potential representing a plateau in ionic charges across the membrane. This is then followed by phase 3, which is depolarisation, where the membrane returns back to its resting membrane potential. So you can see here that they share phases, but they're all slightly different. So both slow and fast share phase 4. They have a phase 0. The fast response has a phase 1 and 2, while the slow response doesn't. And then they both share phase 3 and a phase 4. But you can see here that all the phases are slightly different between them based on the movement of the ionic charge or the membrane potential over time. These changes between the slow and fast response can be demonstrated by showing the movement of ions through the cell membrane to produce the membrane potential. So in blue at the bottom, we've got a line, and this represents the cell membrane, and anything moving up is into the cell, and anything moving down is out of the cell. So beginning at phase 4, which is the resting membrane potential, depending on the textbooks you read, it will sit at about negative 85 to negative 90 millivolts. So here the membrane's stable, which is represented by this flat line moving forwards in time. And this is because there's equal inward and outward currents of potassium moving out and sodium moving in. We then move on to phase 0, which when the pacemaker cell depolarizes or sends a signal down or an action potential down towards the ventricular myocyte, this will lead to a sudden increase in the membrane potential. And once it hits about negative 70 millivolts, there's this rapid opening of fast sodium channels, also known as INA, that produce this rapid depolarization. At the same time, potassium conductance also decreases. So there's this rapid increase in positive ions entering the cell, which increase the membrane potential, making it more positive, peaking at around 40 to 50 millivolts. This inward sodium current only happens for about a few thousandths of a second, and then quickly these sodium channels close, so the inward current will then stop. This is followed by phase 1, which is partial repolarisation. And there's 2 processes that terminate depolarization here. Firstly, there's a rapid decrease in the sodium permeability when there's inactivation of the fast sodium channels. Then there's voltage sensitive transient outward potassium channels, also known as ITO, that open, allowing potassium ions to diffuse out of the cell, because remember, the concentration of potassium outside the cell is much lower than inside the cell, so potassium will naturally follow its gradient and try and leave the cell. Then there's phase 2, which is the plateau phase, and during the plateau phase there is this long period, which is about 150 to 200 milliseconds of relatively stable depolarized membrane potential, which is a feature that's unique to the ventricular action potential. So this is because depolarization due to those fast sodium channels in phase 0 increases the permeability to calcium ions by opening the L-type calcium channels, allowing calcium to enter the cell down a concentration gradient. And the membrane potential during this plateau phase is relatively constant because the inward flow of calcium ions is balanced by an equal but outward flow of potassium ions. Then we get to phase 3, which is repolarization phase. So at the end of the plateau phase, the L-type calcium channels begin to close, meaning that the outward potassium current is now greater than any inward calcium current or sodium current. And there's opening of the delayed rectifier potassium channels, which creates the IKR, which is the potassium rectifier current, meaning that there's repolarization of the cell membrane as potassium leaves the cell, bringing it back to resting membrane potential, beginning phase 4 all over again. So the time taken for this action potential to go from depolarization at phase 0 to repolarization at the end of phase 3 to start its resting membrane potential in phase 4 is about 250 milliseconds, and is called the refractory period. The refractory period is this important feature of the cardiac myocyte, as it means that during the refractory period it can't be re-stimulated. And there's two parts to the refractory period. So in yellow, there's the effective or absolute refractory period, where no matter what size stimulus comes through or action potential from the pacemaker, the cell cannot be re-stimulated and won't activate. And this is due to those fast sodium channels all being deactivated and in an inactive phase where they can't be reactivated in this point in time to depolarize the cell. Then in green is the relative refractory period. And what this represents is that in this period, even though we're still within the refractory period, if a strong enough stimulus comes by, the cardiac myocyte can still be stimulated to then depolarize, as enough of those fast sodium channels have now recovered to then depolarize the cell and be activated again. Now this is important to know about because it explains why the heart can't be tetanized. So tetany is when there's constant contraction of the muscle, and it comes in different forms, but just to simplify it, is when the muscle is always in a contracted state. So the reason why the heart can't be tetanized is because the refractory period of the ventricular myocyte is longer than the contraction period of the myocyte. To demonstrate this, if in grey we draw muscle contraction, we can see that as the muscle contracts just after the peak of the stimulus, so once the action potential is depolarized in phase 0, briefly afterwards the muscle will contract and its peak tension occurs somewhere in the plateau phase, and then the muscle will relax before the end of the repolarization phase in phase 3. So by the time we reach phase 4 again, or the resting membrane potential, or within the relative refractory period, the muscle's already relaxed. So you can see here, if there is a pacemaker action potential or some kind of action potential that is strong enough and firing constantly, such as in tetany, it can't stimulate the muscle within that absolute or effective refractory period. But then potentially when you get to the relative refractory period, it could stimulate another action potential leading to contraction. But by then the muscle has relaxed enough that diastole has occurred with the heart, that then the heart will then contract as normal. So your heart will continue to beat despite the rest of the body being tetanized. This mechanism not only protects the heart against tetany, but it also helps protect the heart against ventricular arrhythmias as well, and something I'll talk about in later videos. Thank you for watching. If you have any questions or anything you want me to cover or anything you want to add, please feel free to drop it in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe to help support the channel.